On June 6, 1944, the most frightening thing over Normandy was not the German Air Force. It was the space where the German Air Force should have been. Before dawn, more than 156,000 Allied soldiers were moving toward France. Every planner had feared the same possibility. Once, the beaches filled with men, landing craft, trucks, radios, medics, ammunition, and command posts, the Luftwaffe would fall on them from above. This was not paranoia. 5 years earlier, Germany's air arm had helped tear Poland open in days. In France, it had attacked forward airfields so quickly that hundreds of Allied aircraft were ruined before they mattered. In the Soviet Union, it had smashed thousands of planes on the ground at the opening of Barbarossa. So the Allied planners treated German air power as a real threat. They mapped it. They gamed it. They built fighter cover around it. And then, on the day of the largest amphibious invasion in history, the Luftwaffe managed roughly 70 sorties across France. 70 takeoffs. Not 70 raids, not 70 formations, not 70 victories. 70 aircraft movements against the invasion that Germany had spent years warning itself would come. 2 German pilots, Josef Priller and his wingman, cut low across the beaches and fired into the invasion front. For a few seconds, Allied soldiers looked up and saw what they had expected to see all morning. Then the sky closed behind them. The question is not why the Allies won the air over Normandy. The question is how the most feared tactical air force in the world became a ghost before the decisive battle even began. The answer begins with the thing that made the Luftwaffe terrifying in the first place. Not metal, not engines, doctrine. In September 1939, the Luftwaffe was built around an idea so aggressive it almost sounded like a religion. Strike first, strike fast, and paralyze the enemy before he can organize a response. The airplane was not treated as a distant weapon. It was a hammer at the exact point where an enemy army was still trying to become an army. In Poland, the method looked unstoppable. German fighters and dive bombers wrecked Polish airfields, disrupted command, and then shifted to support the armored columns driving across the country. The lesson seemed obvious. If the enemy cannot think, he cannot move. If he cannot move, he cannot stop what is coming. France made the lesson feel even more dangerous. May 1940. German aircraft hit forward fields, transport nodes, roads, bridges, and troop concentrations. The French command system was still trying to understand the shape of the attack, while German armor was already forcing its way through the Ardennes. The Luftwaffe did not win the campaign alone, but it gave the German army the one thing every fast-moving army needs most: time stolen from the enemy. Then came June 1941. At the opening of Barbarossa, Soviet aircraft were caught in vast numbers on exposed forward airfields. Planes burned before pilots reached them. Maintenance crews, fuel stocks, command posts, and the human machinery behind the aircraft were hit at the same time. For a while, the German advantage was not just tactical, it was institutional. German pilots had experience. German units had confidence. German commanders understood how to coordinate air power with ground movement at a speed their enemies struggled to match. By 1941, the Luftwaffe had become a habit of victory, and that habit hid the weakness inside it. Germany had built an air force for short wars. Its leaders did not expect a long arithmetic problem. They expected campaigns, decisive blows, foreign airfields, enemy air forces destroyed before replacement systems mattered. So the training pipeline stayed too thin. The home defense force was treated as a secondary problem. Experienced pilots were used like a reusable resource, except they were not reusable. A machine can be repaired, a runway can be patched, a fuel tank can be refilled, but a pilot who has survived 200 combat hours is not a part you order from a factory. The Luftwaffe did not understand that soon enough. In 1942, General Hans Jeschonnek, the Luftwaffe's chief of staff, said he would not know what to do with more than 300 fighters a month. 300. For an air force fighting from Norway to North Africa, from the Atlantic coast to the Eastern Front. That sentence only makes sense if the war is already supposed to be won. On August 17, 1943, the American 8th Air Force began teaching Germany what a long war actually sounded like. That morning, 376 B-17 Flying Fortresses crossed into Germany in a deep penetration raid split between Schweinfurt and Regensburg. One force aimed at the ball-bearing plants, the other at the Messerschmitt complex. The raid was bold. It was also exposed. The bombers pushed beyond reliable fighter escort, and the Luftwaffe came at them for hours. By the end of the mission, 60 B-17s were gone. 600 men were dead, captured, or missing. The Americans called it a costly blow against vital industry. The Germans saw something more disturbing: range, scale, intent. That night, Jeschonnek was dead by suicide. The man who had dismissed the need for fighter production at American scale had watched the first shape of that scale arrive over Germany. But the Americans had their own dangerous illusion. Before Pearl Harbor, American air planners had written a blueprint for strategic air power that imagined something enormous: 250 combat groups, more than 105,000 aircraft, more than 2 million airmen. It was industrial thinking on a continental scale. At the center of it sat a belief that would bleed men before it broke. Heavily armed bombers, flying tight formations in daylight, could defend themselves deep inside enemy territory. They could reach the critical nodes of Germany's war economy: ball bearings, aircraft plants, oil, transportation. If the right targets were removed, the machine would stop. That was the theory. The sky over Germany corrected it. On October 14, 1943, more than 290 B-17s went back to Schweinfurt. The crews already knew the name. They knew what had happened there in August. They knew the P-47 escorts would not be able to stay with them all the way. They knew that after a certain point, the only defense left would be the guns inside their own formation. Most of the men were barely old enough to have lived a full adult life. 21, 22, some younger. The Luftwaffe tracked them early and attacked them hard. 60 fortresses were shot down. 17 more were so badly damaged they would never fly again. More than 100 others came back torn open, burning, leaking, or carrying dead crewmen. The mission became known as Black Thursday, and the conclusion could no longer be hidden inside confident press lines. The 8th Air Force had not yet won air superiority over Germany. It had discovered the price of trying to bomb without long-range escort. For a time, the deepest raids were suspended. Not because the target theory had been abandoned, because the bomber force was being consumed faster than morale could explain. Then the war changed shape, not in a speech, not in a single invention, in a delivery schedule. By January 1944, the American industrial engine had caught up with the American airplane. Major General James Doolittle arrived to command the 8th Air Force and inherited a force far larger than the one that had staggered through 1943. Hundreds of additional bombers, hundreds of additional fighters, fresh groups, more crews, more machines, And among those machines was the aircraft that destroyed the Luftwaffe's last comfortable assumption, the P-51 Mustang. With the Merlin engine and metal drop tanks, the Mustang could go where the bombers went, not to the edge of Germany, to the target, to Berlin, and back. For more than a year, German fighter defense had been built around one belief. American escorts must turn away before the bombers reached the deepest targets. That belief had shaped interception timing, fighter concentration, and the brutal confidence of the German attacks. In early 1944, the belief became obsolete. The Luftwaffe did not yet feel it. Doolittle did. His order changed the air war in a way that sounds simple only if you forget the thousands of men inside the bombers. Fighters were no longer chained to the bomber stream like guards walking beside a prisoner. They were released. They swept ahead. They hunted assembly points. They attacked interceptors before the interceptors could form. They followed German fighters downward, outward, and back toward their own airfields. The goal was no longer merely to protect the bombers. The goal was to make the Luftwaffe rise into a fight it could not afford. Operation Argument was built for that purpose. History remembers it as Big Week. The official target set was German aircraft production, factories in central and southern Germany, assembly plants, engine works, Messerschmitt facilities, industrial sites that looked on paper like the places where air power could be broken. But the target list hid the deeper mechanism. The bombers were not only striking factories, they were bait. The purpose was to force the German fighter arm into the air in daylight against bombers that now had Mustangs reaching all the way to the battlefield. The Americans had learned something the Luftwaffe had forgotten. You do not destroy an air fortress only by destroying its aircraft. You destroy it by making its best pilots spend themselves faster than their nation can create replacements. February 20, 1944. East Anglia before dawn. The weather was miserable. Low cloud, poor visibility, cold air sitting over the fields. Ground crews moved under harsh lights, finishing bomb loads, checking engines, pulling chocks, doing the work that turns strategy into motion. The forecast offered just enough hope of clear sky over the targets. General Karl Spaatz made the decision. Let them go. 1,000 heavy bombers rose into the clouded dark. Think about what that means physically. 30-ton aircraft, full fuel, full bomb loads, crews climbing through dirty weather, formations assembling by timing, instruments, discipline, and luck. One mistake could turn a takeoff into a fireball. One navigation error could break a formation before Germany ever saw it. And still they went. On the first day, more than 1,000 bombers and hundreds of escort fighters struck 12 industrial targets across Germany. The expected losses had been terrifying. The actual loss that day was 21 American aircraft. Still men. Still crews, still families receiving telegrams, but not the catastrophe planners had feared, because for the first time, German fighters found American fighters waiting where American fighters were not supposed to be. The geometry had changed. The second and third days were uglier. Weather broke up portions of the force. Some bomber streams were exposed. Losses rose sharply. Bombs also fell where they should not have fallen. At Nijmegen, a Dutch city, more than 200 civilians were killed. That belongs in the story because air strategy was never clean, just because the maps were clean. War does not become surgical because planners draw straight lines. But even through the confusion, the main exchange continued. German fighters came up. American fighters met them. German pilots attacked the bombers because their entire defense demanded it. And every time the Luftwaffe rose, it risked the one resource it could least replace. By February 25, the final day of Big Week, American bombers were again over places that had already become names of dread. Regensburg, Augsburg, Stuttgart, Fürth, Schweinfurt. The same geography that had nearly broken the daylight bombing campaign in 1943 was now becoming a killing ground for the German fighter force. The Luftwaffe still fought hard. This matters. It did not disappear because its men lacked courage. German interceptors pressed attacks through flak, fighter cover, bomber guns, cloud, exhaustion, and shrinking fuel margins. Unit records from the final day describe enemy fighters attacking in small groups with extreme aggression. They came in anyway. That was the tragedy of the German position by 1944. Courage could still put an aircraft in the air. Courage could not repair the replacement system. At German Fighter Command, General Major Josef Schmid looked at the week's losses and reached the conclusion that mattered. In the long run, he wrote, the fight was hopeless. Now look at the accounting, because the accounting is where the real story hides. Across Big Week, the Allied air forces flew thousands of bomber sorties. The Americans lost 226 bombers and 28 escort fighters. The Luftwaffe lost roughly 290 fighters destroyed, with about 90 more damaged. Those are aircraft numbers. The more important number was human. In less than a week, the German fighter arm lost an estimated 17 to 18% of its experienced pilots killed, wounded, or otherwise removed from combat. Not trainees, not names on a future roster. The men who knew how to live inside the few seconds that decide an air battle. Men who understood the closing speed of a head-on pass. Men who knew when to break away from a bomber box. Men who could read a formation's weakness before the formation read theirs. Men who had made enough mistakes to know which mistakes killed you. That knowledge was not written on the side of a Messerschmitt. It was inside the pilot, and when he died, it left the war. Here is the part that makes Big Week easy to misunderstand. The factory campaign did not work the way its planners hoped. German aircraft production did not collapse in 1944. It rose. Germany built more than 40,000 aircraft that year, the highest annual aircraft output of the Third Reich. Factories were bombed, roofs collapsed, buildings burned, machine tools were buried and dug out, production was dispersed, work was moved, assembly was reorganized, the buildings suffered, the output recovered. So if you only ask whether Big Week destroyed German aircraft production, the answer is complicated. But if you ask whether it destroyed the Luftwaffe's ability to convert aircraft into combat power, the answer is much clearer. Because an airplane on a dispersal field is not an air force. An engine in a crate is not an air force. A fuselage under camouflage netting is not an air force. A production graph climbing on paper is not an air force. An air force is trained men, fuel, maintenance, command, timing, radio discipline, repair crews, ground control, experience, and enough surviving instructors to make the next generation better instead of worse. Germany was losing that system. The fighter arm was gaining only a small net number of new pilots each month, while experienced men were being burned away by losses that no school could match. To fill cockpits, Germany shortened training. Some replacement pilots reached combat with around 50 flying hours. American fighter pilots entering the fight often had several hundred. That gap is not just a statistic. It is the difference between a pilot who has practiced emergencies and a pilot who meets his first real emergency over Germany with a Mustang behind him. It is the difference between aggression and survival. It is the difference between being brave and being ready. On March 4, 1944, American bombers went to Berlin with hundreds of fighters around them. The Luftwaffe came up in force. The Americans lost dozens of B-17s. It was still brutal, still costly, still a day families would never forget. But the Luftwaffe lost far more aircraft than it could afford to lose, and behind those aircraft were pilots Germany could not replace at the same level. The exchange rate had moved against Germany, and it stayed there through March, through April, into May. Every major fight tightened the same spiral. More German pilots lost, less time to train replacements, less fuel for training, fewer veterans available as instructors, more inexperienced men sent forward, more inexperienced men killed. The Luftwaffe still had aircraft, but the Air Force inside the aircraft was thinning out. By early summer, the collapse had reached the place where Germany could least hide it: France. For years, German air power had been built to attack at the moment of maximum vulnerability, and there was no vulnerability like Normandy on the morning of June 6. Beaches crowded with men, landing craft jammed in the surf, vehicles bogging down, engineers clearing obstacles, radios failing, commanders trying to understand which units had landed where. A whole invasion balanced between momentum and disaster. If the old Luftwaffe had still existed, this was the kind of morning it had been built to exploit. But the old Luftwaffe no longer existed. Not as a functioning strategic weapon. The aircraft were scattered. Fuel was short. Command and concentration had been battered. The fighter force had been pulled into months of attrition above Germany. The veterans who could make the system dangerous were dead, wounded, exhausted, transferred, or trapped in a machine that could no longer deliver them where they were needed. So the invasion came. The Allies looked upward, and mostly saw their own aircraft. The Luftwaffe managed about 70 sorties over France that day, followed by more activity at night that still failed to change the battle. 2 German pilots made a low strafing run across the beaches. Then the great terror of Allied planning became a thin line in an operations report. 70 sorties. That number is not small because Germany lacked airplanes. It is small because an air force is not counted only in airplanes. Germany surrendered in May 1945 with thousands of frontline combat aircraft still on hand. Machines remained. Combat power did not. There was not enough fuel to use them properly. There were not enough trained pilots to use them well. There was not enough intact system left to turn inventory into force. That is the brutal lesson Big Week revealed and the Normandy sky confirmed. The Allies thought they were bombing factories. They were also forcing a human system into a rate of loss it could not survive. The Luftwaffe had begun the war as the symbol of offensive shock, speed, surprise, and violence arriving before the enemy could answer. It ended with aircraft it could not launch, pilots it could not train, and skies it could not contest. The factories came back, the pilots did not. And on the morning Germany most needed its air force, the sky over Normandy answered with absence.